Welcome to our latest Kingsley Napley webinar, part of our Immigration Update series. Today, we'll be giving you an update on the latest developments on Brexit and the relevant issues around EU nationals living in the UK or considering coming to the UK. This webinar is intended for EU nationals who will find it relevant, but also to employers who are employing EU nationals. And we would be very happy for those employer clients of ours listening to this for you to share it with your employees. I'm Nick Rollason. I'm head of the immigration team at Kingsley Napley, and I'm joined by Katie Newbury, one of our senior associates in the immigration team.
So to get us started, Nick, could you just give us a reminder of where we are right now and how we've got here?
Thanks, Katie. Yes. So it's a year now since the Article 50 of the European Union Treaty was triggered on 29th March 2017, and we've come quite a long way. I think at the time that was triggered, people were very uncertain about what was going to happen. There was a lot of anxiety amongst the EU national communities in the UK, but we have had quite a few developments. The first one that was really relevant was last summer, where the Home Office and the government published a document entitled Safeguarding the Rights of EU Nationals in the UK and EU Nationals in the EU, in which they first introduced the idea that they would create a new settled status for those EU nationals already here to protect their rights of residence. In July of last year, we also had the withdrawal bill, which is starting the process of the UK leaving the EU. And in the summer as well, we have the Migration Advisory Committee were commissioned to prepare a report on the impact of Brexit on employers and the labour market, and how employers would deal with the problems around skills and talent coming to the UK once Brexit takes place. And many of our clients attended roundtables with the Migration Advisory Committee to talk through what their experiences were with their national labour force and what they were concerned about might impact them after Brexit. In August 2017, we had a leaked Home Office paper on what might happen to the UK immigration system after Brexit, and Katie will talk about that a little bit later, about what the possibilities will be once we finally do leave. And we've had a few other speeches, some joint reports, really culminating on the 19th of March this year, 2018, with the draft withdrawal agreement, which was launched in Brussels to much public and media attention, really focusing on what has been agreed between the UK and the EU, particularly around the rights of EU nationals living in the UK and UK nationals living in the EU. So I'm going to hand over to Katie and really ask for the next part of our presentation. Katie, if you could tell us, what is the position of EU citizens who are living in the UK right now?
Yeah, so the position as of right now is that for EU citizens who are in the UK or looking to arrive, nothing has actually changed. They can continue living in the UK, exercising treaty rights as a worker, as a self-employed person, as a student, job seeker, or somebody who's self-sufficient. The real distinction that we're going to start seeing is that from the end of this year, they will be able to apply where they qualify to do so for the brand new settled status, which will be the new status which is going to apply to a post-Brexit Britain. Now, settled status has been described as by Caroline Noakes as something which is going to be relatively simple to obtain. She said earlier in the year that they intend to make sure that the settled status scheme is as straightforward and easy as possible, and that anybody who can demonstrate residency for 5 years will certainly find it an easy process to get through. We're not going to apply any tests about whether people have been working and exercising their treaty rights. It literally is just if they can demonstrate residency. So for those who are here and who have either completed a period of 5 years in the UK or will be completing that, they will be in a position to apply for the brand new settled status from later this year. They won't have to apply for it immediately, but it may be something they want to get done sooner rather than later, given that there's likely to be high demand for this new status. Those who haven't yet completed a 5-year period will, as we'll discuss further, be able to remain in the UK until they've completed that 5-year period. Those who've already obtained confirmation that they have permanent residence in the UK, but haven't or don't wish to obtain British citizenship at this time, will be able to convert their permanent residence to settled status under what we hope will be a very simple and straightforward process.
Thanks, Katie. Could you just tell us, we're leaving the EU on the 29th of March 2019. Can you tell us what will change when that date comes up and we've actually left?
Yeah, so what we expect to happen on the 29th of March 2019 is that we will enter into a transitional period. So in theory, nothing major should happen. There'll be no massive changes on that eve. People will continue with the current status that they have. But that will really be the time at which people will need to start thinking about what their status is going to be at the end of that transitional period. And in particular, those who have not yet acquired settled status but are eligible to do so will really want to begin looking at that process. And those who haven't got settled status may be required to obtain at that point evidence of their status in form of a temporary residence document, and they'll certainly need to think about getting such a temporary residence document towards the end of the transitional period if they haven't yet qualified for settled status. As we talk about the end of that transitional period, Nick, what will be the position for people who arrive during the transitional period?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so what happens to people during the transitional period is still the subject of some negotiation, although most of the things have been agreed between the UK and the EU on that, what will happen in that period. So what we know so far is that if you are an EU national arriving in the transitional period, you may be required to apply for a temporary residence document. At the moment, as you know, as an EU national, you don't have to do anything and you can live in the UK without obtaining any documents. But it is likely that that will change, and the UK seems to have indicated that that will be the case. So that will be the first change. And what you will receive if you apply for that residence document is a temporary residence document which will be valid for up to 5 years. And that will hopefully take you through to the end of the transitional period and beyond, if you arrive in that period. And when you complete the period of 5 years, either before or after the end of the transitional period, you will then be able to obtain settled status, because permanent residence beyond the transitional period will no longer exist. There are some changes around the eligibility of the ability of EU nationals to bring in family members during the transitional periods. They're very minor, but generally EU family members will be able to come and join their EU national partners, children, parents, etc. during that period. So there won't be any significant changes. And those arriving during that transition period will have up to 6 months after the end of the transition period, so after the 31st of December 2020, to then apply for this temporary residence document, or if they qualify for it, for the settled status. So we're looking at a period of under 2 years, during which not much will change. Things will be regulated under a different system, which will have more of a UK feel to it, but in essence, not much will change other than new arrivals possibly having to go and register through a simple process to say that they're here, they've arrived, and to tell the Home Office what they are doing. So my question for you, Katie, was really looking at the future and after the transition period. What do you think is likely to happen to EU nationals and the UK immigration system, and how do you think it will change based on what we know at the moment?
Yeah, so the one thing that we definitely do know is going to change is that the government is keen for us to end freedom of movement as it currently exists. So the current system under which EU nationals can arrive in the UK is almost certainly going to end with the end of the transitional period. That said, what's going to replace it is still mostly an unknown, although we have an idea of the types of options which are likely to be open to the government. So there was a report in June of last year, which was leaked to the public, which set out a range of potential options which could apply to a future immigration system. And really, the things that are likely to define any future immigration system is, first of all, answering the question of whether or not EU citizens will continue to benefit from some sort of preferential treatment over and above what non-EU citizens have to satisfy in order to gain entry to the UK. And that's certainly an option which could form part of any negotiated deal with the EU. It could be something which is only in existence for a temporary period, or it could be a permanent feature of our immigration system in the future. The current system that we have for non-EU nationals, and that's the points-based system, could be rolled out to cover EU nationals as well, but it's likely that something beyond that will be required, as the current system is not currently meeting the needs of employers in the UK. We know that the Migration Advisory Commission is currently looking at options, and they're evaluating the needs of employers in the UK, particularly with regards to gaps in the market where we don't have the skills that we need to satisfy the UK jobs market, and also dealing with areas which aren't covered by the current UK immigration system for non-EU nationals, particularly in relation to low-skilled workers. So the three options that are likely to be presented will either be that the current system, which applies to non-EU nationals, will be rolled out to EU nationals as well. We will have two concurrent systems, so a preferential treatment system for EU nationals and then the existing system that we have for non-EU nationals, or we could have a completely new immigration system which covers both EU and non-EU nationals, but which differs considerably from the system which is currently in place.
Thanks, Katie. So could you just tell us if, at the moment, EU nationals can bring in family members into the UK, that includes their spouses, their partners, their children, and also their dependent parents, and in some cases wider family members. So there are provisions under EU law to bring in a whole raft of family members who are dependent with you when you move to the UK, or who were dependent before you moved to the UK. Is that going to change, and will you be able to bring in family members to the UK in the future as an EU national?
So the current provisions which allow EU nationals to bring family members to the UK are more generous than those provisions which exist under UK domestic law. And those provisions will continue to exist up until the end of the transition period, which we expect to be the end of December 2020. However, from January 2021, there will be a distinction in the family members which EU citizens can in fact bring to the UK. They will continue to be able to bring certain family members to the UK under the existing more generous family rules. That will include any partners that were their partners up until December 2020. It will include children or grandchildren under the age of 21, dependent children or grandchildren who are older than 21, and dependent direct relatives in the ascending line. If they get married after December 2020, for example, that spouse will not be a pre-existing partner, and they would have to bring them to the UK under the existing domestic rules which we have for bringing family members to the UK. In addition, other dependent relatives who can currently come to the UK under EU rules, which can include aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, cousins, will not be able to come to the UK after December 2020. They would in fact have to already be here when the transition period ends in order to continue to enjoy a right of residence in the UK under EU rules.
Thanks, Katie. So can I ask you another question about that? So if, for example, you're an EU national living in the UK and you have a parent who's fairly elderly and unwell who's living, say, in Italy, would you be able to bring them over if they hadn't been dependent on you before?
That's something that we will need to get clarity on. It's certainly important that the relationship between you and the family member existed before the end of the transitional period. Whether we would need to establish the dependency existed is something that I think will require us to clarify following the release of the withdrawal agreement.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful, because I know a lot of our clients are concerned about what will happen to their family members who are outside the UK if they might want to bring them in to live with them for the last years of their lives particularly.
Yes, and that's obviously particularly important because it's very difficult under the current rules we have in the UK, outside of EU rules, to bring any kind of dependent relative to the UK. So, Nick, is there anything else that EU citizens in the UK should be thinking about right now in light of what we know at this point about the future?
There's lots of things they should be thinking about. I think the main thing to take note of is that I think EU citizens can be a little bit more relaxed about their status, because there's been a lot of progress on this. And certainly our experience talking to clients and talking to various communities in the UK has been that while people are still concerned and angry, some of them about Brexit and upset, there is certainly a way forward that we can see now for them to remain here and not have a problem being here. I think the key things to think about are principally these. The first one is to do with whether people should apply for permanent residence, bearing in mind that there is now this new UK settled status which will be available from the end of 2018. The problem about the settled status at the moment is we don't know exactly what the criteria for obtaining it are. We think it's going to be quite easy, as you said, but we don't know whether when you obtain it, it will be obtained on that date, or whether it will give you a settled status date from, say, a year before you acquired it, when you, say, acquired permanent residence under EU law. So we're not quite sure about that, and that may have a significant impact, particularly for those who are thinking about getting British citizenship. We have a lot of clients who are asking whether they should get British citizenship. That's really a decision for them, and it will be looking at a number of different factors, including whether they can hold dual nationality. But one of the big issues is that some EU countries, like Germany, only allow dual nationality if you're applying for a second citizenship of an EU member state. And clearly, if you do that after the UK leaves the EU, you may not be able to get British citizenship and still hold your German citizenship, and that applies to a number of countries. So if you're thinking about getting permanent residence and you might want citizenship, we would suggest that you get permanent residence now and then show that you've completed that extra year with permanent residence if you have already done that. And that will mean that you'll be able to apply for and get British citizenship before we leave the EU. So I think that's important to think about that. Also, EU nationals who don't have any status at the moment, if they're here already, they don't need to get resident status. And people are saying, well, why should I? I'm feeling a bit annoyed about having to do this, but and also in the transitional period, if you're already here, you don't actually have to apply for a residence document during the transition until the very end of that transitional period. If you're already here. So, the problem with that is that we are seeing more problems now with individuals, particularly EU nationals, being asked for documentation. Whether that's right or wrong is a good question. It's probably unlawful, but people like landlords, for example, are now asking more and more people, including EU nationals, for evidence of their residence in the UK to show who they are. And that is something that we are dealing with at the moment, but our recommendation is that if you can get a document, whether it's a registration certificate if you've been here for less than 5 years, permanent residence if you've been here for 5 years, or settled status later this year once you complete the 5 years as well, you should apply as soon as you're eligible, because there will probably be a big rush towards the end of the transitional period to get these documents. And we're saying apply when you're eligible, and we think it's relatively straightforward now to get permanent residence if you've been here for 5 years and you qualify. The final thing I would say is children. If you have children who are eligible for British citizenship, either because you were working in the UK when they were born here before 2000, up to 2000, or you acquired permanent residence before they were born after 2000, then we would very strongly recommend that you take steps to make sure your children can get British passports. And that's because we're not quite sure what the effects of settled status will be and how that will interplay with British citizenship. We're confident that the Home Office will think this through and make sure that people aren't adversely affected, but we don't know. So we would recommend that if you have kids born in the UK who are eligible for British citizenship, please take steps to get their British passports now so that they are sorted out and that they're not caught out by some strange rule that happens with the introduction of settled status and the end of permanent residence. So I think that concludes our Brexit seminar. If you have any questions at all that come up from the webinar, please do feel free to email either myself or Katie. If you have any specific questions, we'll be very happy to answer them. We will be doing another webinar probably in the next month or so, which will have a bit more detail about the rules and regulations and the transitional provisions. But we hope you've enjoyed this brief webinar and that it's provided you with some answers to some of the questions you might have.